Monday, and, more specifically, felt that the method adopted by the French government was inadmissible because of its unilateral nature. Emphasizing the community quality of the Europe to be built, implying a spirit of solidarity which went beyond individual nations, this speaker advanced the view that French diplomacy no longer believed in this concept and preferred to confront its partners with a fait accompli. But a French participant belonging to the government majority group replied that the cessation of European construction dated back rather to the 17th of April 1962 when the Fouchet Plan was rejected, a plan which represented an initial stage in that it provided 4 periodical meetings between governments, a clearly defined organization covering defense and foreign and cultural policy which may have been modest but which could have been the embryo of a greater organization. The French attitude in January 1963, said the speaker, was solely due to the fact that it was impossible for Great Britain to accept all the conditions of the Rome Treaty. The building of Europe meant accepting one's share of the responsibilities and burdens. Addressing the meeting again towards the close of the discussion, the Belgian speaker emphasized that, as a supporter of an integrated Europe rather than of a simple alliance, he considered British participation in the European institutions vital since French opposition made the former formula impossible. A British participant, supported by various other speakers, considered the Brussels breakdown to be the result of a combination of factors rather than of the French government's attitude alone, and that the responsibility should not be attributed exclusively to the President of the Republic. With the support of other speakers in the subsequent discussions, see item E of the agenda, he argued that it was above all essential to avoid any policy calculated to hinder Great Britain's association with Europe when the time came. A number of American participants considered the contention that their determination to intervene on behalf of their allies was any less than in the past to be utterly without foundation. In particular, they stressed the extent of American forces in Europe and the importance of their country's financial contribution to joint defense. Nearly 400 American troops were stationed in Europe, some of them accompanied by their families, and this demonstrated the permanent nature of their commitment, although the North Atlantic Treaty had been sold to the American public without any implication that American ground forces would be stationed in Europe under it. In this respect, actions had outstripped commitments, just as the United States had already intervened in 2 world wars without having previously committed itself to do so. The American attitude had always been governed by long-term considerations without regard to the circumstances of the moment. Similarly, on the financial level, military expenditure had continued to be extremely heavy. At the present time, 60 cents out of every dollar of public funds went to defense. Must the United States go bankrupt, asked one speaker, in order to convince its European friends? Many U.S. congressmen would be only too happy to see Europe take over the defense of Europe, if only to save the $3 billion which it cost to maintain American troops on the continent. In fact, however, not one American congressman, even though all would one day have to seek re-election, queried the commitments entered into with America's allies. An American speaker also commented that continued European suspicion of American promises might eventually bring about a swing in United States public opinion which would have regrettable consequences. A French participant, supported by a Belgian participant, a German speaker and a British participant, condemned all and every display of suspicion concerning American determination to remain in Europe. To question that determination, he said, almost amounted to clearing the way for such an eventuality. Another French speaker occupying an independent position observed, however, that allowance must be made for strategic evolution which, within a few years, might deprive the presence of American troops in Europe of any meaning, especially if the concept of Fortress America, which was already suggested by the present development of Polaris and Minuteman missiles, were to become a reality. The Soviet Union might be tempted to confront the West with challenges which it would seem irrational to answer with nuclear methods, and many Frenchmen, and even other Europeans, feared that the United States might consider a threat to the Europeans as not necessarily a threat to itself. This did not signify suspicion. Within such a context, English and French efforts might be seen as an attempt to find a sort of European parachute to be used in the event that the alliance did not immediately operate. Another French participant, already mentioned, and an advocate of the National Strike Force, denied that he had the slightest doubt as to the determination of the present American presidential team. But was it always possible, he asked, to foresee the future? And should not the confidence which the Americans sought be reciprocal? The disproportion between the contribution of the United States to joint defense and that made by its partners was likewise recognized by a British participant as a source of uneasiness on the European side. Such a disproportion could not continue indefinitely. This point was expanded on by the French participant just referred to. When NATO was conceived, he pointed out, the imbalance was in accordance with reality because of America's monopoly in the atomic field, a field which, however, had nothing like the importance which it now possessed. Since then, Europe had achieved a spectacular recovery, and the feeling was developing that the alliance must be rebalanced, and Europe strengthened in close cooperation with America. But the United States wanted to maintain its monopoly, not only as regards manufacture of nuclear weapons but also as regards the decisions concerning them. America was especially apprehensive that it might be drawn into a conflict through error or some rash action. Accordingly, said this speaker, everything proposed by America, a multinational or even a multilateral force, seeks to convey the impression of a certain sharing of responsibility while retaining the sovereign right to press the button, and it was this approach which France opposed. In addition, the speaker continued, it is not desirable that the alliance should seek to restrict the efforts of the Europeans to the conventional field by allotting them, as it were, the role of footsloggers. Finally, at the present time, the military effort in the nuclear sector conditioned, so to speak, however regrettable this might be, the development of an atomic industry, a field in which the lack of balance is also very pronounced. In reference to the United States' overkill capacity, which had previously been cited by a German participant as the main element in preserving world peace, an American participant emphasized that the best deterrent was the one which was technically capable of ensuring victory and that it was vital to avoid underestimating the capacity of the USSR, whether in the nuclear or conventional field. In order to cover all objectives within the minimum space of time, maximum capacity was essential. Arguing along similar lines, a Turkish participant considered that this superiority constituted the best deterrent force available within the alliance and that, if this was a fact, it was erroneous to pretend that the United States thereby imposed its will on its allies within NATO. This point was also taken up by a Belgian participant who contended that if the Americans could be blamed for anything it was not because they had not applied their leadership with sufficient consistency and force. Criticism of this leadership, a German participant observed, often reflected a Maras-type nationalism, since there was no example of the United States having sought within NATO to impose a resolution with which the other member countries refused to associate themselves. A British participant asked whether it was certain that Europe was ready to assume all its responsibilities, more especially of a financial order, to establish a genuine balance with the United States. At the present time, it would seem not. Returning to the problem of the relation between nuclear forces and conventional forces in NATO's strategy, which had been raised by a German participant, two speakers from that country emphasized that flexibility in the choice of possible reprisals was essential. A defense system which only had nuclear forces available would find itself in the position of a policeman with nothing but a submachine gun to preserve order. It was up to the Allied powers to make their contribution in those complementary fields where inadequacies were apparent. On the other hand, said one of these speakers, if we invest too much in conventional arms, which is not the case at present in Europe, we run the risk of weakening the credibility of our deterrent force. While not denying that the alliance was confronted with various problems, an American participant contended that, on the basis of its practical operation, its balance sheet was a positive one and that substantial progress had been made since 1949. In discussing the American nuclear monopoly, it should be remembered that this only applied to the possession of such weapons. The speaker referred to the plans which had been drawn up to allow for the use of nuclear and conventional weapons alike and pointed out that such plans had been made by an integrated inter-allied team comprising virtually all member nations. Similarly, SHAPE, an organization possessing a regional structure, received its orders from the Standing Group which, in turn, was governed by the NATO Military Committee in which the political lines were laid down by 15 nations. The military command merely applied these directives. The plans, drawn up with great care in order to conform to those directives, were designed to meet two primary considerations: to ensure adequate control, especially involving avoidance of premature use of atomic weapons without orders from a higher level, this being a political element of key importance; to ensure, in the nuclear field, an adequate and sufficiently rapid reprisal policy. The danger of a proliferation of national nuclear weapons was raised by certain speakers in connection with the French government's decision to create an independent deterrent force. A French participant, already mentioned several times and who set himself the task of explaining the policy of the French government at this juncture, outlined and defended the reasons underlying this decision. Apart from the considerations already mentioned above, uncertainty as to the future, the American monopoly, the necessary development of a nuclear industry, the French government considered that any nuclear force should be subject to a political authority which, for the moment, is national in nature, since only national states can assume the crushing responsibility of using it. It might one day be possible to envisage a supranational force, but this was not a reality as of now. Nor did France wish to place its defense, i.e., having regard to possible future developments, its whole destiny, in any other hands but his own. In this respect, the French followed exactly the same reasoning as the British. Why, asked the speaker, should something which was good for the British be bad for the French? France, too, wished to be able to play a deterrent part. Another reason why a nuclear force was necessary was that it enabled the smaller countries to weigh more heavily in the scales as regards political and military affairs. It was impossible to speak of dissemination in this connection, said the speaker, since the French government could not, as certain observations might have suggested, be compared to some sort of potentate Führer threatening world peace. Such dissemination, moreover, had already begun and might progress still further tomorrow without the United States being in a position to resist it. Furthermore, the policy in question was one which had reached a point of no return and had already been initiated by the leaders of the Fourth Republic. The fact remained, said an American participant, that the proliferation of nuclear weapons constituted a real danger, since the possible launching of even one or two missiles could unleash a nuclear holocaust. In this connection, there was a tendency to think of nuclear weapons as a mere extension of conventional weapons, whereas the reprisals which the former might provoke could not be limited to a specific region but could immediately extend to the whole Western world. This latter point was likewise emphasized by another American participant. A Netherlands participant stressed that the European countries could not wait and do nothing but must take steps to promote the Atlantic Partnership by strengthening Europe. But how could action be taken if there was the permanent possibility of veto by a single nation? The speaker insisted that Western defense could not be guaranteed by a juxtaposition of national nuclear powers. The question was whether we were going to build an organization for peace on national rivalry between sovereign states, and therein lay the responsibility of our generation. A Belgian speaker, already quoted, regarded the French decision to acquire an independent nuclear force as the real cause behind the breakdown of the Brussels negotiations, because of the position adopted by Great Britain in the Bahamas, and expressed vigorous opposition to that decision. The principles which had governed Western policy for 15 years past were being challenged, and this seemed to be due to France's determination to possess an independent nuclear force. What political